The Unpaid Ledger, Episode 8, The River. Chapter 1, The Drive. Route 9 heading north out of Ashford was the kind of road that made you forget cities existed. Two lanes, no shoulder, trees pressing in from both sides like they were trying to take back what the highway department had stolen. February had stripped them bare, and the branches scratched at the gray sky like fingers reaching for something they couldn't name. The beater didn't like hills. Never had. The engine whined every time the road tilted upward, and the heater had two settings, volcanic and off. I kept it on volcanic. My coat did the rest. Something under the dashboard rattled with every bump, a sound I'd been meaning to investigate for 3 years and would probably investigate 3 years from now. Eddie sat in the passenger seat, visible, solid, watching the trees go by with the particular attention of someone who couldn't feel wind or cold or motion, but remembered what they used to feel like. Marcus couldn't order this stuff online? Eddie said, stretching his legs into the footwell. Eddie's legs didn't need stretching. He just liked pretending they did. Apparently not. His contact in Harrowfield doesn't do shipping. Says the mineral compound degrades if it's not stored properly, and he doesn't trust anyone else's packaging. So we're driving 4 hours round trip for a jar of magic rocks, Eddie said, leaning back against the headrest with exaggerated disbelief. Containment-grade calcite suspension. I downshifted for a hill. The engine whined in protest. It's what keeps the silver vessel stable. Magic rocks, Eddie repeated, as if saying it again would make me admit he was right. Expensive magic rocks, I said, keeping my eyes on the road. Eddie almost smiled. The road curved. The trees thinned for a moment, showing a field brown with winter, then closed in again. We drove in silence for a while, not uncomfortable. We'd done this enough times that the quiet had its own shape. Eddie watching the world, me watching the road. The radio off for once, just engine noise and the occasional rattle from something under the dashboard that I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. 20 minutes outside Ashford, the trees opened up for good. Rolling farmland. Barns that had seen better centuries. The kind of landscape where you could see weather coming from miles away. Eddie spoke without looking at me. We're outside Ashford. Eddie's voice shifted. Quieter. The wisecrack gone. No sensors. No team. No crystal full of disease. Just you, me, and whatever this car is pretending to be. It's a car, I said, though the rattling under the dashboard did little to support the claim. It's an apology note from the automotive industry. He turned to face me. You said soon, at the office, about the river, about what happened. I remember, I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Is this soon enough? Eddie asked, watching me with an expression that was careful and patient and entirely unlike him. The road stretched ahead, flat, empty. 2 hours of nothing but farmland and small towns with names like Harrowfield and Pleasant Grove and whatever else settlers had called places before. They knew what they were getting into. No interruptions, no excuses, no emergency to hide behind. Yeah, I said, kept my eyes forward. This is soon enough. I didn't look at him. My hands steady on the wheel, which was new. 2 days ago, they'd been shaking so bad I couldn't hold a coffee cup. You showed up at my office on a Tuesday, I said. Middle of October, 7 years ago. Eddie was quiet, waiting, his form perfectly still beside me, the way it only got when something mattered. I hadn't seen you since we were 17. Chapter 2, The Client. 7 years ago, my office was almost the same as it is now. Same building, same broken elevator, same window facing the same brick wall. But the filing cabinet worked. The coffee was marginally less terrible, and the name on the door was still spelled wrong. Some things are eternal. I was 27 years old, and I looked it. 3 years into the trade, paying rent most months, building a reputation as someone who did clean work and didn't ask too many questions. Marcus had taken me under his wing in a way he'd deny if you asked him, and I'd started getting referrals that weren't just a guy who knows a guy. I was reading a case file when the knock came. 4 in the afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. Eddie Lusk walked in, and for about 3 seconds I was 17 again. Standing in a parking lot outside Ashford South High School, throwing a football back and forth while the streetlights came on. Eddie had the arm. I had the mouth. We'd been inseparable from the time we were 12 until his mom moved them to Columbus the summer before senior year. I'd gotten a phone call that fall, a few letters that winter, then nothing. People drift. Life fills in the gaps. You tell yourself you'll reconnect, and then a decade passes like a long afternoon. 10 years of gaps stood in my doorway. He looked wrong. Not sick exactly, but diminished, like someone had turned down his brightness. He was thinner than I remembered, and his eyes had a hunted quality that I'd started to recognize in clients. The look of someone being followed by something they couldn't see and couldn't outrun. "Hey, Sammy," he said, leaning against the doorframe like he needed it to hold him up. Nobody had called me Sammy in a decade. The word hit somewhere between nostalgia and grief. "Eddie." I stood up. Didn't know whether to shake his hand or hug him or just stand there. Ended up doing all three in the wrong order. "What are you? How did you sit down? You want coffee? Is it terrible?" He dropped into the client chair like he'd been walking for days. "Legendary," I said, already reaching for the pot. The word covered a lot of sins. "Then yeah." He sat in the client chair and his hands went to his lap, the way they did when he was nervous. I remembered that from when we were kids. Every time he got called to the principal's office, every time he had to explain a bad grade to his mom, hands in the lap, fingers laced, holding himself together. The coffee bought us 5 minutes of catching up. Surface stuff. His mom was fine, retired to Florida. My parents were the same, still in the old neighborhood. He'd bounced around after Columbus, Detroit for a year, Pittsburgh for 2, back to Columbus. The kind of trajectory that suggested instability without explaining why. He didn't mention a wife or kids or anyone who might be waiting for him to come home. I didn't mention the adjusting at first. He knew what I did. That was why he was here. But we both circled around it, talking about everything else. The old neighborhood. The diner on Caldwell, where we used to eat after football practice. Mrs. Patterson, the English teacher who'd predicted we'd both end up in prison. She was half right, Eddie said. Then he stopped smiling. The small talk ran out. The coffee went cold, and Eddie got to it. "Something's wrong with me, Sam." His voice dropped, the humor gone. "I don't know what it is, and I don't know how to fix it." 6 weeks of his life falling apart. Lost his job at a warehouse in Columbus for no clear reason. Girlfriend left. Landlord evicted him. Health problems that doctors couldn't name. Persistent headaches, fatigue, a tremor in his left hand that came and went. Food going bad faster than it should. Electronics dying in his proximity. A bike messenger who'd nearly hit him twice in the same week. I knew the pattern. I'd seen it in clients before. Costs landing on someone who hadn't earned them. The systematic grinding of misplaced consequence. "How'd you find me?" I asked, setting down my mug. Asked around. Eddie shrugged, trying for casual and missing by a mile. "You'd be surprised how many people in Columbus know about adjusters. They said you were the best in Ashford. They were being generous. They said you were the most honest." His hands tightened in his lap. "That's what I need right now, Sam. Someone honest." I should have asked more questions. Should have pushed harder on what he'd been doing in the 10 years since Columbus. Should have wondered why someone whose life was falling apart would drive 3 hours to find a specific adjuster in a specific city instead of finding someone closer. But it was Eddie, and he was hurting. And I was 27 years old and still believed I could fix anything if I tried hard enough. "I'll take a look," I said. "No charge." "Sam, I can pay." Eddie started, reaching for a wallet that looked thinner than it should have been. "You can buy me dinner. After." I pulled out my kit. Salt, iron filings, the tools of a trade I was still learning. "Let me see what we're dealing with." I touched his hand, connected, and felt something that made my stomach drop. The costs on Eddie were heavy, layered. Professional work, the kind that took years to learn and a particular lack of conscience to execute. Someone hadn't just misplaced consequences on him. They'd built a structure. Costs nested inside costs. each layer reinforcing the ones beneath it, like finding a bomb inside a bomb inside a bomb. Eddie, I said carefully, what exactly were you doing in Columbus? His eyes shifted, just for a second, a flinch he couldn't hide. Working, warehouse stuff, nothing interesting. Because this isn't random. Someone did this to you deliberately. Someone who knows what they're doing. I don't know what you're talking about. But he wouldn't look at me. Eddie, I said again, and waited until he met my eyes. He pulled his hand away, stood up, walked to the window, and stared at the brick wall like it had answers. I got into something. His voice was different now, smaller, the voice of a kid who'd gotten caught and knew it. I can't tell you what. Not because I don't trust you, because if I tell you, it puts you in the same place I'm in. I'm already in it. You walked through my door. Then let me keep you in the shallow end. He turned around, met my eyes for the first time since I'd asked the question. Can you move the weight off me or not? That's all I'm asking. I don't need you to understand it. I just need it gone. Chapter 3. The Job. I spent 3 days mapping the cost on Eddie. 3 days of touching his shoulder, his wrist, his forehead, tracing the architecture of what someone had built inside his life. It was meticulous work, like diffusing a bomb by feel in the dark. Eddie stayed in my apartment, slept on the couch. We ate takeout and talked about high school and avoided everything that mattered. He was good at deflection, always had been. The class clown who could redirect any conversation with a joke, a story, a change of subject so smooth you didn't notice he'd done it until later. But at night, when he thought I was asleep, I could hear him pacing, back and forth across my living room, 5 steps one way, 5 steps back, the rhythm of someone counting down to something he couldn't name. Once, around 2 in the morning, I heard him talking, low, urgent, into a phone he must have borrowed. I couldn't hear the words. When I asked him about it the next day, he said he'd been talking in his sleep. He wasn't sleeping. The costs I'd mapped were worse than I'd initially read. Heavier, denser. Whoever had placed them was operating at a level I'd never encountered. This wasn't a dirty adjuster cutting corners. This was craftsmanship. Precise. Intentional. Each layer of cost was calibrated to release slowly, grinding Eddie down week by week. Designed to kill and look like bad luck until it was too late for bad luck to be the explanation. Eddie would be dead in 2 months if I didn't move the weight. Maybe less. I found a target. An abandoned textile factory on the waterfront, scheduled for demolition in the spring. Empty, isolated. Big enough to absorb the costs without affecting anything nearby. Textbook placement. I'd done a dozen like it. Marcus helped me prepare. Didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated. He studied the cost structure I'd mapped and went quiet for a while. Turned it over in his mind the way he turned objects over in his hands. Slow. Careful. Then he looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Be careful with this one, young man. Whoever built it wanted it to stay." "I can handle it," I said, with the confidence of someone who had no idea what he was walking into. "I'm sure you believe that." He handed me a containment flask, just in case. "Take this anyway." The night of the placement. October 19th. Cool air. Clear sky. Eddie and I drove to the waterfront in the beater, which was only 3 years old then and still had a working radio. The city thinned as we headed east. Warehouses. Empty lots. The bones of an industrial district that had died decades ago. I parked outside the factory fence. Eddie sat beside me, quiet for once. The building loomed against the sky. 3 stories of dead brick and broken windows. "This is going to feel strange," I told him. "Like something heavy lifting off your chest. Don't fight it. Just let me work." "You always were bossy." Eddie leaned against the car door, arms crossed, trying to be casual. Failing. "I'm being professional." "You're being bossy professionally. There's a difference." He grinned. For a second, just a second, he was the kid I'd known, the one who could make anything funny. Then the grin faded, and he looked at the factory. Looked at it the way you look at a building you're about to trust with your life. "I trust you, Sammy." Those words. I'd hear them in my sleep for years. We walked to the factory. I found a support column on the ground floor. Good contact point. Solid concrete and rebar. I placed Eddie's hand on my shoulder and my palm flat against the column. Source and target. The circuit completed. I pushed. The first layer came free without trouble. Surface costs, the newest ones, peeling away like dead skin. I channeled them into the column, into the concrete, into the bones of a building that was already dead. The second layer resisted. I pushed harder. The costs clung to Eddie, embedded deep, fighting to stay. I pulled, and the building groaned. Steel settling. Concrete cracking somewhere above us. Normal sounds for an old structure taking on weight. The third layer broke something. Not in the building, in the costs themselves. When I pulled at the deepest layer, the whole structure came apart. Not cleanly. The nested costs unraveled and expanded, tripling in size. What I'd been moving carefully, layer by layer, suddenly became a cascade. Everything releasing at once. Everything demanding balance at once. The column under my hand shattered. Concrete exploding outward. The ceiling above us cracked. Dust and debris raining down. And the costs snapped back to Eddie. All of them. Not just the ones I'd been moving. The originals plus the interest that the ledger charged for my failed push. A debt that had been heavy before was now crushing. The ledger wanting its balance. The math demanding completion. Eddie made a sound I'd never heard from a human being. Something between a gasp and a scream, cut short because his lungs were already failing. He dropped. I caught him, lowered him to the ground while the factory groaned and settled around us. Eddie? Eddie, stay with me. His eyes found mine, already glazing. The costs eating him alive, consuming him the way they'd been consuming him for weeks, but now in real time. Accelerated, compressed, minutes instead of months. I dragged him out of the factory, into the night air, down the slope to the riverbank because it was the nearest flat ground, and I wasn't thinking straight. I was just moving, dragging my dying friend through dirt and gravel with no plan and no options. And Chapter 4. The River. The water was black, moving slow under the bridge, carrying whatever the river carried at midnight in October. Leaves, debris, the reflected light from a city that didn't know two men were dying on its bank. Eddie was on his back, breathing, but each breath was shallower than the last. I could feel the costs grinding through him, every system failing, not one thing killing him, everything killing him. The weight of a debt so large that his body couldn't carry it and stay alive. I tried to push the costs into the ground, connected, pushed. The riverbank rejected them. Too loose, too shallow, not enough structure to hold what needed to be held. The costs bounced back, and Eddie's body jerked like he'd been hit. I tried the water, pressed my hand to the surface, the river cold enough to ache. Pushed. The current carried the costs 10 feet downstream, and then they boomeranged back, heavier than before. The ledger adding penalties for each failed attempt. Interest on a debt I couldn't pay. I tried the bridge supports. Concrete and steel, the closest thing to a proper target I could reach. Dragged Eddie 20 feet along the bank, his weight barely anything. His body shutting down system by system. Pressed my palm to the concrete. Pushed. The cost went in for a half second, maybe less, and then came screaming back. The support wasn't big enough. Nothing was big enough. I tried myself. Pressed both hands to Eddie's chest and pulled, trying to take the costs into my own body the way I'd take a punch for a friend. They wouldn't come. The ledger wouldn't allow a transfer to a willing target with no debt to settle. I wasn't the right shape. The math didn't work. Nothing worked. Eddie's eyes found mine again, lucid. He knew. Stop, Eddie said. Barely a whisper, air leaking out of lungs that were shutting down. Sam, stop. I'm not stopping, I said, already reaching for the ground again, already looking for anything that might hold what needed to be held. You can't fix this one. His hand found my wrist, grip weaker than a child's. Fingers cold, getting colder. Some things can't be fixed. Everything can be fixed. That's my whole job. My voice was shaking. I couldn't stop it. Not this, he said, the words coming slow, each one costing him something. He tried to smile, failed, tried again, and got halfway there. Not everything. I knelt beside him on the riverbank, my oldest friend dying under my hands, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't accept what was happening, because accepting it meant Eddie was dead and I had killed him. I'd made the push. I'd broken the structure that was holding the costs in place, and now Eddie was paying the price for my confidence. The ledger pressed down. I could feel it like a physical weight, the balance demanding closure. Eddie's death was owed. The math was absolute. There was no target big enough, no vessel strong enough, no trick clever enough to move what needed to be moved, unless I moved it somewhere that didn't exist. The idea came the way bad ideas always come, not as a thought, as a reflex, like pulling your hand off a hot stove. My body knew what to do before my mind caught up. I grabbed Eddie, both hands on his shoulders, connected, and instead of pushing the cost towards something, I pushed them away from everything, not into a target, not into a direction, into the space between directions, the gap where reality hadn't decided what it was yet. Nowhere. The ledger screamed, not a sound, a pressure. Every nerve in my body lit up at once. Wrong, wrong, wrong. What I was doing violated something fundamental, not a rule. Rules can be bent, a law, the kind that holds atoms together and keeps gravity pointing down. I pushed harder, Eddie's death in my hands, flooding through me, and I shoved it sideways into a direction that didn't have a name. I tore something. I could feel it give way, like fabric ripping, like bone cracking, like a door being forced open that was never meant to open. The costs went through, into the gap, into nowhere. And the ledger took its payment. It started in my hands, still on Eddie's shoulders. I watched the skin change, watched it happen in real time, the smoothness leaving, replaced by something rougher, veins rising to the surface, knuckles thickening, age spots appearing like ink drops on wet paper. The change crawled up my arms, muscles tightening and losing elasticity at the same time. My elbows ached, my shoulders hunched. Something in my left knee popped and began to ache with the deep familiarity of an old injury that had actually just been born. My metabolism shifted. I could feel it, absurdly, like gaining 20 pounds in a heartbeat. Not fat, just density. The lightness of youth replaced by the solid, heavy feeling of a body that had been used hard for 2 decades. My vision blurred, sharpened, blurred again, and settled into something slightly less clear than it had been a minute ago. My teeth ached. My gums receded. I could feel my hair changing texture, coarsening, thinning, the color draining out of it like water from a sponge. 27 years old. In 15 seconds, I looked 45. I felt it in every joint, every muscle, every cell. Not pain exactly, something worse. The weight of years I hadn't lived settling into a body that hadn't earned them. Eddie gasped, drew breath. His eyes flew open, and they were different. Not alive exactly, not dead. Somewhere in between, flickering. His body on the riverbank was present but wrong, like a television signal that kept cutting in and out. Sam. His voice was distant, echoey, coming from somewhere that wasn't quite here. Sam, what did you do? I couldn't answer. I was on my hands and knees, my new old body shaking, my joints screaming, every cell in me recalibrating to an age I hadn't earned. The world looked different through older eyes, dimmer, less certain. Sam, what did you do? Eddie's voice cracked through the space between us, louder now, edged with something that sounded like terror. The gap I'd torn was still open. I could feel it inside me, not closing, not healing, just there. A hole in the ledger where my name should have been written and wasn't. A space that shouldn't exist, connected to me because I'd made it. Eddie was in that space, part of him, tethered to the gap the way a boat is tethered to a dock. He couldn't leave it. Couldn't go back to being alive. Couldn't finish dying. Stuck. I saved you, I whispered, the words coming out wrong, thick, old. I think. A sound from the darkness. Not the river. Not the city. Footsteps. Deliberate. Unhurried. Coming from the tree line on the far bank. A woman stepped into the moonlight. She'd been there already. That was the thing I'd understand later, telling the story 7 years after the fact. She hadn't come running when the factory exploded, hadn't been drawn by the commotion on the riverbank. She'd been standing in the trees when we arrived. Before the job, before the push, before everything went wrong. Waiting, mid-30s, dark hair, professional, even standing on a riverbank at midnight. She wore a coat that was too expensive for the waterfront district, and she carried herself with the stillness of someone who'd been watching a long time and wasn't finished yet. She looked at me, at Eddie flickering on the ground between alive and not, at the tear in reality I could feel but not see. Her expression wasn't shock, wasn't horror, wasn't even surprise, satisfaction, the quiet kind, like a scientist watching an experiment produce the predicted result. You're going to be very useful, Samuel Vance. Who are you? I managed, and the voice that came out belonged to someone I hadn't met yet. 45 years old and born 10 minutes ago. She didn't answer. Studied me for another moment, the way Marcus studied an object he was appraising, calculating its value, measuring its potential. Then she turned and walked back into the trees, unhurried, like she had nowhere to be and all the time in the world. I tried to stand. My knees buckled. The new old body wouldn't cooperate. My joints had 45 years of wear that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago, and they weren't shy about announcing it. Chapter 5. After. The first mirror I looked in was in the factory's security booth, 3 hours after the river. Dawn coming up gray over the waterfront. Eddie flickering beside me, not understanding what he was, not understanding why he couldn't feel the cold. The face in the mirror belonged to my father. That was my first thought. Then I adjusted, and the face belonged to a stranger. Lined, gray at the temples, jaw softer than it should have been, eyes that looked tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. 27 years old, looking at 45. I touched my face. The stranger in the mirror touched his. Same movements, same confusion, same dawning horror. Sam. Eddie's voice behind me, distant and close at the same time. Sam, I can see through my hand. I turned around. He was staring at his palm, held up to the early light. It was translucent. The wall behind him visible through his fingers like dirty glass. I know, I said, and the weight of those two words was enough to fill the room. I'm dead, Eddie said, turning his hand over slowly, watching the light pass through his skin. Sort of, I said, because that was the closest thing to truth I had. What does sort of mean? Eddie asked, his voice climbing with a fear I'd never heard from him before. It means I don't know what you are, but you're here. You're talking to me. That counts for something. Counts for what? His voice cracking. Not anger yet, just fear. Raw, animal fear of the kind that comes when the ground disappears and you can't find it again. What am I, Sam? What did you do? I told Marcus 3 days later. Not all of it. Enough. He came to my apartment, stopped on the threshold, looked at me, at the gray hair and the lined face and the body that moved like it had been carrying weight for decades. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he came in, sat down, and poured us both a drink from a flask he kept in his vest pocket. The job went wrong, I said. I can see that, Marcus replied, his eyes moving over my face the way they moved over damaged objects in his shop. Eddie's dead. Sort of. He's here, but not. I gestured at the corner where Eddie sat, invisible, still trying to understand what he was. I broke something, Marcus. Something in the ledger. And now there's a gap, and Eddie's in it, and I don't know how to fix it. Marcus drank, set the glass down. You can't fix it. That's what Eddie said, I told him. staring at the glass in my hands. He was right. Marcus looked at me, and his eyes were the oldest thing in the room. What you tore can't be stitched back together, Sam. You made a space that shouldn't exist. Your friend is in it, and you're connected to it. Those are facts. What you do with them is up to you. I was 27 3 days ago, I said, and heard my own voice crack on the number. You look older, Marcus said, not unkindly. 15 years older, give or take. Marcus nodded slowly. The ledger takes payment. Always. You broke its rules, and it charged you in the only currency you had. Time. He finished his drink. You're not dying. The years are gone, not going. You're stable. Just older. Just older, I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. There are worse things. Marcus stood, straightened his vest. I once knew a man who tried to cheat the ledger out of a property debt. It took his sense of taste. Everything he ate for the rest of his life tasted like ash. He headed for the door. 15 years is steep, but you're alive. Your friend is something. And whatever gap you've made, it's yours to carry. He left me with the flask. I sat in my apartment with my new old face and my dead but not dead friend, and the knowledge that I'd torn a hole in reality that I couldn't close. The weeks that followed were education through disaster. Eddie learning what he was, discovering he could go solid or transparent, that he could walk through walls, but not always when he wanted to, that he could move about 100 feet from me before his form started to break apart, pulling him back like a rubber band. He'd push the boundary every day, testing it, walk down the block until the edges of his body began to dissolve, then snap back to my side, cursing. 100 feet, he said one evening, dropping onto the couch he couldn't feel. That's my whole world. 100 feet in every direction from you. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it down to whatever was left of my bones. Stop saying that, Eddie said, holding up a hand that flickered at the edges. I started, and he cut me off before the word could land. Stop. Eddie's voice was firm, final, the kind of tone that closed a door and locked it. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't feel temperature or texture or pain. He could hold things if he concentrated, but they felt like nothing in his hands, just pressure and position. No warmth from a coffee cup, no cold from an ice cube. The memory of sensation without the sensation itself. I remember what pizza tastes like, he told me once, staring at a slice I was eating at 2 in the morning. I can describe every ingredient. I can tell you the exact temperature of the cheese when it's perfect. I just can't feel it anymore. He paused. That might be the worst part, not being dead, remembering what alive was like. He didn't remember why he'd been in trouble. The details of Columbus, the warehouse job, whatever he'd been involved in that got costs placed on him, it was fading, dissolving. Like the gray space was digesting his old life, leaving only the bones. He remembered me, remembered being kids, remembered being scared and showing up at my door. But the specifics were smoke. I had a reason, he'd say sometimes, frustrated, reaching for something he couldn't grasp. I came to you for a reason. There was something I needed to tell you, something important. Maybe you will. Give it time, I said, though we both knew time worked differently for him now. Maybe, he said, but his expression said he knew better. The gray space had eaten whatever he'd been carrying. The secret he'd brought to my door, the thing that had gotten him into trouble in the first place, was gone, dissolved into the same nowhere that held his death. He never did. I looked for the woman. Auditor Leyland, though I didn't know her name yet, checked bureau records, asked around, described her to every contact who might know her. Nothing. No one at the bureau had assigned an auditor to monitor my case that night. No record of any official presence on the waterfront. She was smoke, same as Eddie's memories. Within 6 months, I noticed the anomaly. Costs I pushed that didn't land. Small ones at first. A broken Windows repair bill that should have settled on the building's foundation but instead vanished mid-transfer. A medical debt that went into my hands and came out the other side lighter than it should have been. The gap I'd torn, still there, still inside me, swallowing things. I was scared. Then I was curious. Then I was practical. I went back to work, took cases, moved costs, helped people. Pretended my body wasn't 20 years ahead of its warranty. Pretended my partner wasn't a dead man, tethered to me by guilt and supernatural physics. Eddie and I built something. Not friendship exactly, because the foundation was too damaged for that clean a word. Partnership, the kind that forms when two people are stuck together and have to choose between hatred and function. We chose function. Then, somewhere along the way, function became something warmer. He stopped blaming me around year 2. Or stopped saying it, which isn't the same thing but was enough. I stopped apologizing around year 3. Or stopped saying it. Same difference. By year 4, we had a rhythm. He scouted. I pushed. He made dark jokes about being dead. I pretended they were funny. We ate dinner at diners where nobody asked questions, and we argued about things that didn't matter because the things that did matter were too heavy to lift every day. And the gap inside me kept growing, kept swallowing costs that were meant to land somewhere else, kept building something in the gray space that neither of us could see or name. Chapter 6. Harrowfield. The car was quiet when I finished. We'd been driving the whole time. The farmland had given way to small hills, and Harrowfield was visible ahead. A cluster of buildings around a church steeple, gas station, general store. The kind of town that existed because people hadn't gotten around to leaving. Eddie hadn't interrupted. Not once. 2 hours of silence from a man who couldn't go 10 minutes without a wisecrack. That told me more than any reaction could have. So, he said finally, his voice careful, measured. The voice of a man reassembling something that had just been taken apart. You tore a hole in the ledger itself, and I'm what fell through. You're what I wouldn't let go of, I said, the words quieter than I intended. Same thing. He was staring out the windshield, not at Harrowfield, at something farther away, something only he could see. I've been living in that hole for 7 years. The gray space. That's what it is. Not some supernatural dimension. Not an afterlife. A wound. A tear in the fabric of the thing that runs reality. And I'm stuck in the torn part. Eddie, I started, but he held up a hand, still working through it. I'm not angry. He held up a hand. I'm doing math. He turned to look at me. The costs you push, that vanish. They go into the tear, into the gray space, my space. They've been filling it up for 5 years. That's what made the entity. Lena thinks so, I said, keeping my voice neutral. And then Maya's cost, the Batten disease. Eddie leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the posture of someone working through a problem. It went into the same space, but it didn't join the entity, didn't accumulate. It just settled. I felt it arrive. Like furniture, I said. I remember, I said, watching the road narrow as Harrowfield drew closer. So the tear is changing. Eddie's voice was careful, precise, working through it out loud. What you ripped open 7 years ago, it's not just a wound anymore. It's becoming something else. The entity is the old damage, the ugly stuff, costs that fell into a raw wound and festered. But now the wound is healing, closing around what's inside, making a space that can actually hold things without them going bad. I pulled into Harrowfield, drove slow through a main street that was 3 blocks long. A woman walking a dog, a kid on a bicycle. February in a small town. Is that what you think? I asked, pulling to a stop at the town's only intersection. It's what I felt when the Batten cost came in. It didn't land in chaos. It landed in something. A place. Not a wound. A room. He paused. Your room. The one you made when you saved me. I parked outside a storefront with a faded sign that read Kepler's Minerals and Sundries. Marcus's contact. The jar of expensive magic rocks that had given us the excuse to take this drive. Am I the gap? Eddie asked, quiet now, almost gentle, his form perfectly still on the passenger seat. Or am I just stuck in it? The question hung in the car like smoke. The engine ticked as it cooled. I don't know, I said, turning to face him. I've been asking myself that for 7 years. That's not an answer, Eddie said, though his voice carried no accusation. No, it's not, I admitted, and for once the honesty didn't feel like failure. Eddie looked down at his hands. Solid now, more solid than they'd been in months. He turned them over, studying his palms the way Marcus had studied mine at the warehouse. 7 years in a wound, he said slowly, and it's only now starting to heal. He looked up, met my eyes. What if that's what I'm for? Not stuck, not trapped. What if I'm the first thing the wound learned to hold? I didn't have an answer for that either, but something about the way he said it felt right. Felt like a question that was worth carrying, even without an answer. Well, Eddie opened his door. Couldn't feel the cold, but he'd learned to mime the reactions. Old habit. The habit of a man who refused to stop being human just because the technical requirements had changed. When you figure it out, I'd like to know, given that I'm either the landlord or the tenant. We went inside. Kepler turned out to be a woman in her 70s who looked at me the way Marcus's contacts always did, half curiosity, half pity. She had the calcite suspension ready, wrapped in brown paper, handed it over without small talk. I paid cash. She counted it twice, nodded once, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before we'd interrupted her afternoon. The package was heavier than it looked, dense, the kind of weight that suggested something inside was doing more than sitting still. Back in the car heading home, Eddie held the package on his lap. He could hold things if he concentrated. This was concentrated. Sam? Eddie's voice was different now, the wisecracking gone. Just Eddie, just my friend. Yeah? I said, turning the key in the ignition and letting the engine rattle to life. Thank you for telling me. He looked at the brown paper package in his lap. And for what it's worth, I'd rather be stuck in a hole in reality than be dead, most days. Most days? I asked, glancing over at him as I pulled onto the road. The holidays are rough. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. No pun intended. I started the engine, pulled out of Harrowfield, headed south toward Ashford and whatever was waiting for us there. The farmland rolled past. The same fields, the same barns, the same gray February sky. But the car felt different. The silence had a different shape, lighter. Not because the weight was gone, but because it was finally shared. We'd been driving 20 minutes when the radio crackled. We both went still. The radio had been silent the entire trip. 4 hours of nothing. No static, no voices, no Leland. But this wasn't static, and it wasn't a voice. It was a frequency, low, resonant, like a tuning fork struck in a room too large to see the walls. Sam, Eddie said, his form flickering at the edges, not destabilizing, but responding, like the frequency was pulling at whatever connected him to the gray space. That's not a broadcast. That's coming from inside, from the tier. The sound held for 3 seconds. 4. Then it faded. The radio went back to silence. But in those few seconds, I'd felt something. The gray space, the wound, the room, whatever it was becoming, it had responded to the story we just told. To the truth, spoken out loud for the first time in 7 years. Like it was listening. Like it had been waiting. That's new, Eddie said, his voice steady, even as his form was still flickering at the edges, resonating. Yeah, I said, gripping the wheel a little tighter. It is. Is that good or bad? Eddie asked, watching the radio like it might speak again. I drove, thought about a gap that was becoming a room, about costs that settled instead of festering, about a dead man sitting next to me who was more alive than he'd been in years. I don't know, I said, but it's different, and different is all we've got right now. The radio stayed quiet the rest of the way home. Just road noise and engine hum, and the particular silence of two people who'd finally said the thing they'd been avoiding for 7 years. Ashford appeared on the horizon around 4 in the afternoon, the skyline catching the low winter light, the river visible as a dark line threading through the city. The same river, 7 years older. Like me. Eddie saw it too. I felt his attention shift. The river, where it happened, where he died and came back as something else. Sam, Eddie said, his gaze still fixed on the dark line of the river below. Yeah? I said, following his eyes to the water. Next time something changes in the gray space, I'm going to tell you. Not wait. Not sit on it. Whatever this place is becoming, whatever I am in it, we figure it out together. Together, I said, and the word felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in a long time. That's what I said. Eddie turned from the window and almost smiled. It wasn't enough. Wasn't close to enough. The questions were bigger now, not smaller. Who placed the cost on Eddie? Why Leland was waiting on the riverbank? What the gray space was becoming? And what it meant for both of us. But for the first time, we were asking them together.